Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're going way back to the 13th century to explore the world of Peter of Spain, a logician whose work really shaped philosophical thought for centuries. We're going to be using the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy to kind of understand who this guy was, the impact of his writings, and what his approach to logic can still teach us.
And you know what makes this deep dive really intriguing?
What's that?
Peter of Spain's identity is still a bit of a mystery.
Oh.
For a long time, scholars believed he was Pope John the 21st, but
Wow.
recent research has cast some doubt on that.
Really?
Yeah.
So it's like a medieval whodunit?
It really is.
We're starting off with a puzzle.
Yeah.
What do we actually know about this mysterious figure?
Well, we know that he was associated with a work called the Summum Logicalis Magistri Petri Hispani, which basically translates to Collection of Logic Matters of Master Peter of Spain.
Catchy.
Right. This text was super popular in European universities for centuries,
Wow.
even studied by big names like John Buridan.
But the true identity of the author,
Yeah.
still up for debate.
So we may not know exactly who he was, but we can definitely dig into what he wrote.
Absolutely.
Tell me more about this collection of logic matters. What makes it so important?
Well, the work is often called the Tractatus or Summum Logicalis, and it's basically a textbook on logic.
Okay.
What's interesting is how Peter of Spain structured it.
Okay.
He divided it into two main parts.
Okay.
The Logica Antiquorum, which covers traditional Aristotelian logic,
Right.
and the Logica Modernorum, which explores the properties of terms.
Gotcha.
And then each part is broken down into smaller sections called tracts.
Tracks.
Yeah, that focus on specific concepts.
So it's like a deep dive into the nuts and bolts of language and reasoning.
Exactly.
What would be some of the most interesting tracks for like a modern day philosopher to explore?
One that stands out is the De Suppositionibus,
Okay.
which introduces us to Peter of Spain's theory of supposition.
Yeah. This was a key innovation in medieval logic, and it's still relevant today because it helps us understand how the meaning of a word can change depending on the context.
That's something we grapple with all the time, even if we don't use the fancy terminology.
Right.
Yeah, can you give us a simple example of how supposition works?
Sure. Imagine you see the word bank.
Okay.
Does it mean a financial institution or the edge of a river?
Ah, I see.
It all depends on the surrounding words and the situation, right?
Right.
That's supposition in action.
Okay.
Peter of Spain realized that words aren't just static symbols.
Yeah.
Their meaning is dynamic and relational.
So it's not just about memorizing dictionary definitions.
Yeah.
It's about understanding how words function within a larger framework.
You got it.
Interesting.
Yeah, and this is where Peter of Spain gets really interesting.
Okay.
He breaks down different types of supposition,
Okay.
each with its own rules and implications.
Okay.
For example, he distinguishes between suppositio personalis, where a term refers to a specific individual,
Got it.
and suppositio simplex, where it signifies a universal concept. These distinctions might seem subtle,
Yeah.
but they have big implications for how we interpret language and build arguments.
That's fascinating.
Yeah, it is. And this is really where Peter of Spain's work starts to bridge logic and philosophy.
Okay.
He wasn't just focused on like the mechanics of language. He wanted to know how language connects to reality, how it helps us grasp the essence of things, you know?
So how does supposition theory tie into those bigger philosophical questions?
Well, Peter of Spain thought that every term has a significatio,
Okay.
which is its core unchanging, meaning like the concept that a word points to. But the way that concept is used, its supposition can vary depending on the context.
Right.
And this kind of tension between a word's fixed significatio and its flexible supposition
Yeah.
leads to some pretty interesting philosophical discussions.
Could you give us an example of how this plays out in Peter of Spain's work?
Sure, one example he analyzes is the statement, homo est species.
Okay.
Man is a species.
Man is a species.
Yeah, here, the term homo, meaning man, has a suppositio simplex.
Okay.
It's not talking about any particular man, but to the universal concept of man.
Right.
But the statement itself is making a claim about reality. It's saying that this universal concept actually exists as a real thing.
That's a pretty complex idea.
It is.
So Peter of Spain is grappling with the relationship between language, thought, and the world around us.
Exactly. And he's doing it with a level of precision that was really groundbreaking for his time. He breaks down all these different types of supposition, like suppositio naturalis, where a term stands for all the things that share its universal nature.
Okay.
He also looks at suppositio accidentalis, where a term supposition is limited by things like verb tense or adjectives.
Yep.
It's a really thorough examination of how we get meaning from language.
It makes you realize how much we just take language for granted.
I know, right?
We use it every day, but we rarely think about the complex system that makes it all work.
It's like we're driving a car without knowing how the engine works.
Uh-huh. Yeah, and Peter Spain's like the mechanic showing us what's going on under the hood.
Exactly.
So we've talked about supposition theory. What are some other interesting parts of the Tractatus that would be helpful for someone studying philosophy today?
Another tract worth looking at is De Locis,
Okay.
which is all about topical relationships.
Topical relationships.
Yeah, basically it's about the different ways arguments can be built and the rules that make them valid.
So going beyond the simple if this then that structure.
Exactly. Peter of Spain identifies all these loci,
Or
places,
Right.
from which arguments can be drawn like categories of reasoning.
Okay.
For example, there's the locus from definition,
Okay.
where you argue based on the essential qualities of something.
Right.
And then there's the locus from opposites, where you use the idea of non-contradiction to make your point.
Could you give us a quick example of how that works?
Sure, let's say you're arguing that Socrates is not white.
Okay.
Using the locus from opposites, you could say, Socrates is black, therefore he can't be white.
Okay.
It's simple, but it shows a fundamental principle of logic.
Right. So Peter of Spain's giving us this framework for looking at arguments,
Yeah.
seeing their strengths and weaknesses, and making better arguments ourselves.
That's one way to look at it. He's also showing us how logic connects to real-world examples.
Yeah.
And how we can use it to understand the world around us.
It sounds like he was a really good teacher,
He was.
making these complex ideas easy to understand.
Yeah, and that's a big reason why his work was so influential.
Right. But there's another part of his work that's worth mentioning, his exploration of syncategoremata.
Oh, yeah.
We talked about those earlier.
Right.
Those are the words that only have meaning when they're combined with other words, right?
Yes, exactly. Like, only except if.
Right, exactly.
They seem small,
Yeah.
but they're super important for shaping the meaning of sentences. And Peter of Spain wrote a whole treatise called Syncategoremata just about these words.
What's so interesting about these little...
They're like the hidden gears of language. You know,
Right.
the connectors that build our arguments and affect how we understand things.
I like that.
Peter of Spain was really careful about how they work, how they affect whether statements are true or false, and how they can be used to make good arguments or bad ones.
So this work would be especially useful for philosophers
Definitely.
who are always dealing with the subtleties of language.
Absolutely. Understanding these syncategoremata is crucial for anyone doing philosophy or really any kind of rigorous thinking.
This is giving me a whole new appreciation for words.
Me too.
It's like Peter of Spain is giving us a magnifying glass
Yeah.
to see all these little details that we usually miss.
He's a master at taking something simple and showing how complex it really is.
Hmm.
And that's why philosophers are still studying and debating his work today.
Wow, we've covered a lot of ground.
We have.
From the mystery of Peter of Spain's identity
Right.
to his work on supposition theory and syncategoremata.
Yeah. It's fascinating stuff.
It is, but before we wrap up, I'm curious about his legacy. How did his work influence logic and philosophy after him?
His impact was huge.
Yeah.
His Tractatus was like the foundation of logic education across Europe.
Wow.
It shaped the way people thought about the subject for generations.
So he wasn't just this brilliant mind working alone.
No.
He was part of a bigger intellectual tradition.
Exactly. He was key to how medieval logic developed. And his work laid the groundwork for what came later in the late Middle Ages and the Renaissance.
And it's amazing how relevant his ideas still are today.
It really is.
We might not use the same terms,
Right.
but the basic principles he talked about language, logic, and truth, they're still alive in philosophy today.
That's what's so cool about looking at these historical figures.
I know.
Their ideas came from a specific time,
Yeah.
but they're often dealing with questions that are still important centuries later.
It makes you wonder what Peter of Spain would think of our world today,
Right.
with all its complexity and everything.
He'd probably be fascinated and challenged by how language and logic are used.
And misused.
Yeah.
In the digital age.
It's almost like we need a modern-day Peter of Spain
Aha! Maybe we do.
to help us figure out this new world of information.
But even without him, his work gives us valuable tools for critical thinking and analysis.
Yeah.
His attention to detail, his way of arguing, and his understanding of language,
Yeah.
They offer a timeless model for how to deal with complex ideas.
That's a great point. We've really dug deep into the life and work of this mysterious figure.
We have.
And as with any good deep dive,
Yeah.
I'm left with even more questions.
That's a good sign.
It is.
That's what intellectual exploration is all about.
Mm.
It's not about finding all the answers.
Right.
It's about opening up new ways of thinking, challenging our assumptions,
Yeah.
and expanding our understanding of the world. So what's the main thing our listeners should take away from this?
Let me think. If I had to pick one thing,
Oh, yeah.
it would be this. Pay attention to the details.
Okay.
Peter of Spain's legacy shows us that even small words and little distinctions can have a big impact on what we understand from language and how we reason.
Mm.
So be careful in your analysis, be precise with your words,
Okay.
and always be ready to question what you think you know.
Great advice. And on that note, we'll wrap up our deep dive into the world of Peter of Spain. We hope you've enjoyed this journey through the history of logic.
It's been fun.
And we encourage you to keep exploring the world of medieval thought and the power of language and logic.
There's so much to discover.
Until next time, keep those minds sharp and those arguments sound.